Hello, friends. Welcome to Science Talk. I am your host, Jim Massa. There are two reports I wish to share with you that address what planting more trees could do, their impacts on the carbon budget. So scientists now know where to start. This is important. Not just enough to say, oh, we need to plant more trees, but these studies actually looked at where can we replant the trees. This is important. So scientists have now identified places where they can plant trees to start soaking up the CO2, hopefully to cool the planet. And basically, it almost sounds too obvious, but you plant more trees on unused land. So in the first study, and the first study was published in the journal Science, and in the first study, scientists from Switzerland have identified an area roughly the size of the United States. So this is no trivial amount that could be newly shaded by planting more trees. If the world's nations then protected these 9 million square kilometers of canopy over unused land, the new global forest could, in theory, soak up enough carbon to reduce atmospheric greenhouse gas by an estimated 25%. That is, the extent of new tree canopy would be enough to take the main driver of global heating back to conditions on Earth a century ago. A second study that was published in the journal Science Advances, which came out within a week of the first study, identifies 100 million hectares of degraded or destroyed tropical forests in 15 countries where restoration could start right now. 87% of these hectares are in biodiversity hotspots that hold high concentrations of species found nowhere else. So in other words, we'll not only be planting more trees to pull down more CO2 out of the atmosphere, but you'll also be providing a necessary habitat for many endangered species or species found nowhere else. So it's a twofer. So going back to the first study published in Science, researchers looked for land not used for agriculture or developed for human settlement. They excluded wetlands and grasslands already fulfilling important ecological functions. Right? Wetlands is a basic filtration system. It's also a nursery for many juvenile organisms, as are naturally occurring grasslands. So that's what they did. Now, remember, still haven't addressed the problem of overpopulation. I discussed that in my carrying capacity video, where we just have so many people on the planet that there are stresses being placed on the land, to provide enough land for housing, food, conducting business, etc. So there's still that issue, but every bit helps. These researchers left existing forests out of their calculations. They identified enough degraded, wasted, or simply unused land to provide another almost 1 billion hectares, which is approximately 9 million square kilometers of tree canopy. Such new or restored forests could store 205 billion, would it be, tons of carbon. This is about 2/3 of the 300 billion tons of extra carbon humans have been pumping into the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution, some 180 to 200 years ago. Tom Crowther of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, which is nowadays known as ETH Zurich, states that we all knew that restoring forests could play a part in tackling climate change, but we didn't really know how big the impact would be. Our study shows clearly that forest restoration is the best climate change solution available today. Yeah, and you don't have to resort to these stupid geoengineering schemes, which are, to be blunt, harebrained. But Dr. Crowther warns, we must act quickly, as new forests will take decades to mature and achieve their full potential as a source of natural carbon storage. Forecasts for the future start with the data available now. The Swiss team worked from a data set of observations of 80,000 forests and used mapping software to predict possible tree cover worldwide under current conditions. The big unknown is, what will global heating and climate change do for future forest growth? Okay. We don't know how tree growth will be affected with the warming temperatures. Some tree species may do well, others may not. We don't know. Warmer temperatures will affect how organisms grow. I can, being a person who's worked in fisheries, I can tell you that, yeah, warmer temperatures will help increase fish growth up to a point, because it's so much, it gets so warm, their metabolism requires a lot of food, and they have to eat just to maintain the metabolism. They don't grow anymore. So it's a double-edged sword. Organisms evolve to, basically live in preferred temperature ranges. So if nations continue to burn fossil fuels at the present rate, then parts of the world could begin to experience harsher conditions, and by 2050, the area available for tree cover will have been reduced by approximately 223 million hectares, much of this in the tropics. So in other words, what they're stating here now is, if things continue to go as they are, then there will be less land available where the trees can be planted to draw down the CO2, which means less CO2 is drawn down. Now, most of this in the tropics. What's that guy in Brazil doing? Bolsonaro, right? Basically just, let's just burn down the whole frickin' Amazon. So, yeah. Forests are an integral part of the answer to the climate crisis, but forests worldwide, particularly in the tropics, are also vulnerable to extremes of heat and drought and windstorms, which are likely to come as temperatures get ever higher. Okay. And I've done video segments discussing those issues with you. So what are some of the factors? Okay, these researchers have confirmed the importance and value of urban forests. Okay. They have identified huge areas of woodland that have not been previously mapped or recorded. They have tried to make an estimate of the number of trees on the planet and the rate at which they're being felled, grazed, burned, or extinguished. They have identified threats to tropical forests, monitored the increasing damage to or degradation of what are supposed to be protected areas, much of them forests, and they have measured changes in forests as the temperatures rise. Right now, the world has 5.5 billion hectares of forest or woodland with at least 10% and up to 100% of tree cover. Altogether, this adds up to 2.8 billion hectares of canopy. It also has a challenge to get on with, and that challenge is called the Bonn Challenge, B-O-N-N, Bonn, Germany, to extend national forest areas by 350 million hectares by 2030, and has been accepted by 48 countries so far. The Swiss researchers calculated that there were up to 1.8 billion hectares of land of low human activity that could be reforested. If half of this was shaded by foliage, that would yield another 900 million hectares of canopy to soak up and store atmospheric carbon. More than half of this potential tree space was in just 6 countries: Russia, US, Canada, Australia, Brazil, and China. Now let's look at the second study. Second study, as mentioned, appeared in the journal Science Advances, was led by Brazilian scientists. They used high-resolution satellite studies to find that the most compelling opportunities for forest restoration exist in the lowland tropical rainforests of Central and South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Almost 3/4 of the restoration hotspots were in countries that had already made commitments under the Bonn Challenge. The 5 nations with the largest areas in need of restoration are Brazil, Indonesia, India, Madagascar, Colombia. Madagascar is also one of 6 African nations. The others are Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, Togo, and South Sudan that, on average, offer the best immediate opportunities for forest restoration. But of course, going back to Brazil, they just mentioned that whole Bolsonaro thing. Pedro Brancaleone of the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, who is the lead author in the second study, states that restoring tropical forests is fundamental to the planet's health now and for generations to come. For the first time, our study helps governments, investors, and others seeking to restore global tropical moist forests to determine precise locations where restoring forests is most viable, enduring, and beneficial. Restoring forests is a must-do, and it is doable. As I've stated many times before, scientists collect the data. We do the analysis. We see what the data informs us. We then make our determinations. We make our recommendations. We, however, do not make policies. We make our recommendations to the politician. It is up to them to implement our recommendations. And in a lot of cases, we are not seeing that level of commitment from the politicians, especially when in the U.S. and Australia, where the current governments in those countries are basically headed up by people who think climate change is bullshit. It isn't. And there's a bunch of climate change deniers. That does not help, needless to say. So, you know, this is what scientists do. We make our recommendation. The politicians have to act upon our recommendation. It always amazes me when I see, hearings in Congress and they bring an expert before them, and the expert's giving their, they're sharing their expertise, and then the congressperson or senator or whoever it may be is just basically, calling out bullshit on what they're saying. Now, it's one thing to question rigorously. It's one thing to be exacting and to push them on issues to make sure that, they have a good handle on it. That's one thing. Us scientists, we like a good debate. But to then say, well, I think you're wrong, whatever, and then why'd you call them in front of your committee in the first place? Or the other thing I love is, the scientists will say something like, well, our study, we can state with 95% confidence, X, Y, Z, whatever it may be. And then the politician will say, what about the other 5%? Well, congressperson, that's due to natural variation that occurs in any natural system. So you don't know. Politicians do not understand gray. Everything's black and white to them. They don't understand nuance. They don't understand gray. And unfortunately, the world is a nuanced place full of gray zones, not black and white. So there's that issue. You have to overcome the mindset of the politician. Of course, it doesn't help if they're funded by fossil fuel companies. These companies give the politicians money, and they expect something in return. So there is that issue, politics adversely impacting upon science, and politicians not listening to the scientists. So there you have it. Should not come as a big surprise, but it's one thing to state something. It's another thing to have studies that verify or make the argument very strongly that doing whatever it may be helps. In the 2 cases I cited here, planting more trees will help. Yeah, just like another video segment I just did where changing our dietary habits will help. So there are solutions out there. Is it too late? I think it is, but that's just me. But still, we have to try. Thank you for your time. Hello, folks. This is Jim here with Science Talk, asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.